There are lives that exist in the shadows. Lives built not by choice, but by command. Lives stripped of names, of faces, of memory, because memory is dangerous. Memory is a weapon, and some men were never meant to hold a weapon they couldn't control. He had no name, not one that mattered, not one that anyone would speak aloud in daylight. In the files, the ones buried beneath layers of black ink and bureaucratic silence, he was simply referred to as the Asset, a word that meant he belonged to something larger than himself, a word that meant he had no say. They found him young. That's always how it begins, isn't it? They find you when you're still soft enough to be shaped, when the world hasn't yet taught you to question the hands that feed you. He was 19 years old when the first man in a gray suit sat across from him and said words that would hollow out the next decade of his life. "You have a gift," the man said, "and gifts like yours belong to your country." He believed them. God help him, he believed every single word. The training facility had no address. It existed in a place that didn't appear on any map, a compound swallowed by pine trees somewhere in the cold breath of the northern mountains. The men who arrived there left something behind at the gate, not their bags, not their weapons, their identities. He excelled at everything they asked of him. Languages, 4, then 6, then 8. He absorbed them like water through cracked earth. Combat, not the wild, furious kind, but the precise, surgical kind, the kind that ends things quietly. He moved through crowds like smoke. He could be in a room and make every person in it feel like they were alone. They called it the gift of invisibility. He called it loneliness, but only to himself, and only in the hours before dawn when the compound was silent and he lay in his bunk staring at a ceiling that offered him nothing. The handlers were careful never to let any of them form attachments. Attachments created complications. Complications created hesitation. Hesitation got people killed. Or worse, it made them ask questions. And questions were the one thing the program could not afford. So they monitored everything. They read every letter. They listened to every phone call. They watched who he watched. And they noted every flicker of human feeling that crossed his face. And whenever something grew too warm, too human, they redirected him. A new assignment, a new city, a new mission, always moving, never arriving. But then, as it always does in stories like this, something went wrong. Her name was Elena. He wasn't supposed to know her name. He wasn't supposed to know anything about her beyond the target parameters written in cold, efficient language in the mission brief. But on his third day of surveillance, she smiled at a child in the street, a little boy who had dropped his toy, and she bent down and handed it back to him with such gentleness that something inside him cracked open. He filed his report. He described her movements, her contacts, her daily patterns. He did not mention the smile. He did not mention the warmth he had felt in his chest watching it, a warmth so foreign to him that at first he thought he was falling ill. He was not falling ill. He was falling. What happened next, what he chose to do, and what it cost him would not become clear until years later, when he sat in a dark room across from a handler who looked at him like he was already dead and placed a photograph on the table between them. A woman, a child, his woman, his child, the ones he had been told never existed. The program had a protocol for complications. They called it erasure, a clean, clinical word for something that was neither clean nor clinical. When an asset developed what the psychologists called emotional interference, the protocol was initiated.
They didn't hurt him. They were far too sophisticated for that. Pain creates martyrs. Pain creates men who hold on to things with their teeth. Instead, they used chemistry, careful, targeted chemistry, to dim the places in his mind where certain memories lived. They didn't delete everything. They were surgical. They left him his skills, his reflexes, his training. They only took the parts that made him human. He woke up in a white room with no recollection of the 3 months prior. He felt fine. He felt nothing, which they had taught him to interpret as the same thing. He went back to work. And the woman named Elena and the child, with her eyes and his jaw, they slipped beneath the surface of his mind like stones into still water, leaving barely a ripple. Barely. Trust is not a luxury in the intelligence world. It is a calculated risk, a bet placed not with the heart, but with the cold mathematics of probability and usefulness. You trust a man as long as he is useful. You trust an institution as long as it serves the mission. And the mission, always, always the mission, supersedes everything else. He had understood this. He had accepted it as the price of belonging to something larger than himself. He had told himself that the sacrifices he made, the names he gave up, the feelings he buried, the memories they scraped clean, were the cost of purpose. And purpose, he had convinced himself, was enough. It wasn't. The truth about betrayal is that it rarely arrives like a storm. It comes quietly, the way a tide does, retreating so slowly that you don't notice the ground disappearing beneath your feet until you're already drowning. The assignment came through the usual channels: a target in Eastern Europe, a dissident, the brief said, a man who had obtained sensitive intelligence and was preparing to deliver it to hostile actors. The brief was thorough. The evidence was compelling.
The authorization was signed at the highest level. He didn't question it. He never questioned it. That was what they had trained him for. He crossed 2 borders in a single night, moving through the dark infrastructure of a world most people never knew existed. Safe houses with hollow walls, border guards with selective vision, cars with false floors, and documents that would vanish if examined too closely. The target was a professor, mid-50s, gray at the temples. He wore reading glasses and kept a dog-eared copy of Dostoevsky on his nightstand. He had a daughter in university and a wife who baked bread on Sunday mornings. He completed the mission. 3 weeks later, sitting in a debrief room drinking coffee that tasted like nothing, he learned not through official channels, but through a fragment of conversation he wasn't supposed to overhear, that the professor had not been a dissident. The professor had been a witness, a man who had seen something he shouldn't have, who had documented it, who had, in the desperate way of a man with no other options, been trying to get that documentation to the one journalist he believed would not be silenced. He hadn't been a threat to his country, he had been a threat to the men who ran his country. And that, as far as his handlers were concerned, amounted to the same thing. Something shifted in him after that. Not dramatically, not all at once. He was too well trained for dramatic shifts. But quietly, in the deep architecture of who he was, something that had been perfectly aligned began to tilt. He started paying attention to different things, not to the mission parameters, not to the efficiency of his own performance, but to the edges of the picture, the things that weren't in the briefings, the questions nobody asked, the names that appeared in documents and then in subsequent documents didn't appear at all.
He began to notice patterns that his training had equipped him to recognize, but his indoctrination had discouraged him from acknowledging. Patterns of self-interest, patterns of protection, not of the nation, but of specific, powerful individuals within it. Men who operated in the spaces between laws, men who answered to nothing and no one, men who held his file. He said nothing. He continued to perform his duties with the same cold precision that had made him valuable. But behind his eyes, in the place they couldn't reach with their chemicals and their protocols, a question had taken root. What else had they erased? It was a colleague, a woman named Sonia, who had been in the program almost as long as he had, and who had her own reasons for distrust that she had never once spoken aloud, who left the file on his bed. Not a digital file, paper, printed on plain white sheets, folded in thirds, slipped beneath his pillow with the kind of quiet precision that said she had been planning this for a long time.
He didn't read it that night. He held it in his hands in the dark and felt the weight of it. Physical weight and something else. The weight of a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. He read it at 4 in the morning, in the bathroom with the tap running. The file contained 3 years of his life that he had no memory of. It contained a name he recognized without knowing why, Elena. It contained a photograph of a child, a girl perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with her mother's eyes, and a smile that hit him somewhere below the ribs. It contained a document, signed and stamped, authorizing the erasure. And it contained a name, the name of the man who had signed that document. A man he had been briefed on just 2 weeks prior as his new mission handler. A man he was supposed to meet in 48 hours. The tap ran. The knight held its breath. He read the file again, then a 3rd time. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it against his chest, and sat with his back against the cold bathroom wall until the sun came up. By then, he knew what he was going to do. Memory is not a library. It is not a neat collection of cataloged files that you can pull from the shelf in order, review, and return undamaged. Memory is more like a living thing, breathing, shifting, responding to heat and pressure. And when you try to remove a piece of it, it doesn't disappear cleanly. It leaves scar tissue, gaps that ache like phantom limbs, spaces where something used to be that the rest of the mind keeps reaching for, in the dark, without knowing why. They had taken his memories of Elena and their child. They had believed they had done it thoroughly. They had looked at their instruments and their data and their clinical reports and concluded that the erasure was complete. They were wrong, because somewhere beneath the chemical fog, beneath the careful architecture of forgetting, his mind had hidden something, not in a place they could reach with their syringes and their protocols, in a place that belonged to no one but him. It was not a thought, not at first. It was a sensation. He was standing in a market in a city he had been deployed to for reasons unrelated to his past, and a woman across the stalls turned her face toward the winter light, and something in the angle of her jaw, something small and precise and utterly unremarkable to anyone else in the world, stopped him dead. Not her.
She was a stranger, but the shape of her profile triggered something in his chest that he couldn't name. A grief without an object, a missing so acute it registered almost as physical pain. He stood in the market for 6 minutes. He timed it, because that's what he did. He timed things, measured things, cataloged things. 6 minutes of something his training had no category for. Then he moved on. He completed his assignment, he filed his report. But that night, for the first time in years, he dreamed. Not a nightmare, something worse, a dream of warmth, a small kitchen, bread baking, a laugh that he felt rather than heard, small hands reaching for his face, a dream so specific and so vivid that when he woke at 3 in the morning, he lay still with his eyes open and was absolutely certain that it was not a dream. It was a memory, one they had tried to take from him, one that had survived. Once the first memory returned, others followed, not in a flood, carefully, the way a man tests a frozen river before crossing it, 1 foot at a time, testing the weight. A voice, low and warm, speaking his real name, his actual name, the one from before, in a way that held no fear, no expectation, just him as he was. The smell of a specific perfume that he had never consciously registered, but that his body recognized, the way it recognized danger, immediately, viscerally, without thought. A hospital corridor, the sound of his own heartbeat amplified into something terrifying, a nurse asking him to please wait outside. His hands, he noticed, were shaking. He had not known his hands could shake. The memories did not come with full context. They came like fragments of a shattered mirror, pieces of reflection that individually showed nothing, but together, if you held them right, gave you the ghost of a complete image. He gathered each fragment carefully, the way a man gathers evidence,
Because that's what it was, evidence. Evidence that he had been someone. Evidence that someone had decided that someone was inconvenient. He began writing things down, in a code that existed only in his own mind, a system he'd developed over 2 weeks, working backwards from the fragments, cross-referencing dates and locations from his operational history with the gaps that the erasure had left, building a timeline, building a case, building himself back. Here is what he eventually understood. He had met Elena in the field. She had been, in the language of the mission brief, a local contact, a woman with access to information his handlers needed. He had been sent to cultivate her trust, to get close enough to extract what they needed. He had gotten close, and somewhere in the space between asset and mission, between handler and target, something had happened that no protocol anticipated. Something so ordinary, so profoundly human, that the whole elaborate architecture of his training had simply failed to account for it. He had loved her, not as an asset, not as a mission, as a man loves a woman with the full, terrifying, unstrategic weight of a heart that has finally found something worth protecting. They had a daughter, a child born in the space between his missions, in a small apartment in a city that the program's files listed only as a way station. And when his handlers discovered what had happened, when the surveillance logs and the behavioral assessments had finally connected the dots, they had made a decision. Not to end the relationship, not to reassign him, not to counsel him back to compliance. They had erased it, all of it. And now, sitting in the darkness of a safe house in a city he had been sent to for reasons he no longer believed in, with a stolen file pressed against his chest and a photograph of a child he had never been allowed to remember, he understood something with the clarity of a man who has been pushed past the point of fear. They had not done this to protect the mission, they had done this to protect themselves, and that changed everything. There is a moment in every man's life, if he is lucky enough or unlucky enough to encounter it, when the story he has been telling himself about who he is finally meets the truth of what he has done. That moment is not dramatic. It does not arrive with thunder. It arrives in silence, in the space between one breath and the next, in the pause before a choice that cannot be undone. He had reached that moment, and unlike every other moment of decision in his carefully engineered life, there was no briefing for this one, no mission parameters, no handler's voice in his ear to tell him what the objective was and how to achieve it. There was only him, and the file, and the photograph, and the weight of everything he now knew. The meeting with his new handler was scheduled for 48 hours out. He had 48 hours to decide who he was going to be. He moved carefully. That was the only way he knew how to move, with patience, with precision, with a cold economy of action that wasted nothing and revealed nothing. He had been trained by the best in the world to be invisible, to be efficient, to be everywhere and nowhere. Now he turned that training on the people who had built it into him. He spent the first 24 hours doing what they had taught him to do. He gathered intelligence. He accessed systems he was not supposed to access, using backdoor credentials that no one knew he had acquired over years of operational work. Fragments of access, collected like coins, stored against a future emergency. He pulled files. He built a picture. What he found was worse than he had imagined, which was saying something because he was a man with a considerable imagination for darkness. Elena was alive. His daughter was alive. They were living under assumed names in a country he could reach in less than a day. They were alive, and they were safe, and they did not know he existed because the program had reached them too. Not with erasure. Elena was not their asset. She had no security clearance. They had no legal authority to interfere with her mind.
Instead, they had been more straightforward. They had told her he was dead. A fabricated death, complete with documentation and a visit from a man in a gray suit who expressed condolences with the practiced sadness of someone who has delivered this particular lie many times before. They had told her he died in service to his country. They had told her he was a hero. They had told her she should move on. And because Elena was the kind of woman who survived, who took what life handed her and kept walking, she had. She had moved on. She had built a life. And in doing so, she had done the one thing the program had never anticipated. She had given their daughter a future that existed completely outside of their reach. He sat with this for a long time. The relief of knowing they were alive was so enormous it was almost physical, a weight lifting from a place in his chest that he hadn't known was carrying anything. But beneath the relief, something harder, the knowledge that they had made peace with his absence, that they had moved on not because they were weak, but because they were strong, because they had to be. He had missed it all. And the people sitting in their offices, in their secure buildings, with their signed authorizations and their clinical reports, they had taken it from him. The handler's name was Marsh. He was 53 years old, with the careful, contained demeanor of a man who had spent his career managing other people's dangerousness.
He arrived at the designated location 11 minutes early, a habit that he believed demonstrated control. He sat with his back to the wall. He ordered water and did not touch it. He did not know that the man he was waiting for had been watching him for 20 minutes from a position he would never locate. He did not know that the man he had helped to erase had spent the past 48 hours remembering himself back into existence. He did not know that the man who sat down across from him, composed, professional, wearing the expression of every previous debriefing, was not the asset he had helped to engineer. He was someone else entirely. He was a father. The conversation that followed lasted 47 minutes. It was recorded not by the program, but by him, on equipment they did not know he carried. What was said in those 47 minutes would matter later, would matter enormously. But in the moment, what mattered most was the expression on Marsh's face in the final 30 seconds, when he understood what was happening, when he understood that the asset had become something the program's protocols had no category for. A man who knew exactly what had been done to him, a man who had documented it, a man who had nothing left to lose. "What are you going to do?" Marsh asked. His voice was controlled, his hands were not. He looked at the handler for a long moment, thought about everything that question contained, thought about Elena, thought about a child he had never been allowed to hold. "I'm going to remember who I was," he said. Then he stood up, left the recording on the table, and walked out into the light. They came for him 6 hours later. Of course they did. He had expected 6 hours. It was longer than he'd hoped, and shorter than he'd feared.
Long enough. The safe house alarms triggered at 2:17 in the morning. Red lights painting the walls the color of a warning he had already internalized. Boots in the stairwell, the click of earpieces, and the low, controlled frequency of tactical radio communication. He was not there. He had left 3 hours prior, moving through a city that had been his operational environment for long enough that he knew every shadow, every camera blind spot, every route that didn't exist on any official map. He had left something behind, though. Not the recording, he kept that, but a message, written on the back of the photograph they had placed in front of him, the photograph of the woman and child. 6 words: "You should have left me forgotten." Because forgotten men are compliant men. Erased men stay erased. But a man who remembers, a man who has been given back the full weight of what was taken from him, that man is something different. That man is a reckoning. Home is not an address, not for men like him. Home is a concept that the program had spent years deliberately unmooring, pulling up anchor after anchor until he drifted so far from shore that the shore itself became theoretical, a place other people lived, a place that belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. But the fragment of that version, the part they couldn't reach, had always known where home was. It was wherever she was. It was wherever his daughter was. And now, traveling under a name that no system could connect him to, moving through a world that believed him to be exactly where his handler's false digital trails said he was going there. For the first time in years, he was going home. The journey took 9 days, not because the distance required it. He could have moved faster, much faster, but because the kind of disappearance he was executing required patience. He had to move in a way that looked like nothing.
Like weather, like ordinary human traffic flowing through ordinary human channels. He changed his appearance twice, not dramatically. He had learned long ago that dramatic changes drew attention. Small adjustments, the kind of changes that accumulated to produce a man who looked at a glance like no one in particular. During those 9 days, he thought about what he was going to say. He had been trained in persuasion, in deception, in the architecture of human trust, how to build it, how to exploit it, how to dismantle it with surgical precision. He could walk into almost any room in the world and, within 40 minutes, have most of the people in it believing almost anything he chose. But he had no playbook for this, no mission brief, no tactical objective, no measured outcome. He was going to knock on a door in a quiet neighborhood in a country that was not the one he had come from, and on the other side of that door would be a woman who had been told he was dead, and a child who had never been told he existed at all. What do you say to that? He rehearsed 100 versions. He discarded all of them, because every version he rehearsed sounded like something a trained operative would say, calibrated, considered, constructed to achieve a desired response. And whatever came next had to be none of those things. It had to be true, just true, in whatever ragged, insufficient, entirely inadequate form truth took in a moment like this. The street was quiet in the way of streets that have been quiet for a long time. Trees with deep roots, window boxes with winter bare plants. The kind of neighborhood where people recognized each other and noticed strangers, which meant he had perhaps 3 minutes before someone's curtain shifted. The house was modest, clean. The front step had been swept recently.
There was a child's bicycle leaned against the side wall, small, with colored streamers on the handlebars, the kind that a girl of 5 or 6 might have. 5 or 6, that was how old she would be. He stood on the pavement for longer than 3 minutes. He stood there until the cold had worked through his coat and into his bones, and a dog across the street began to take an interest, and somewhere inside the house, a light moved from one room to another, the kind of light a person makes when they're moving through their home, unhurried, safe. He walked to the door. He knocked. The silence after the knock lasted approximately 4 seconds. He counted them. Old habit. Then footsteps. Adult footsteps. Measured, careful, in the way of someone who has learned to be careful about who comes to the door unannounced. The door opened. She had not changed the way time usually changes people. She had simply deepened. The lines around her eyes were new. The set of her mouth was harder in a way that told him what the years had cost her. But her eyes were exactly as he had remembered them, in the fragments the chemicals hadn't reached. The exact, precise, specific color and quality of them. She looked at him. For 3 seconds, she didn't move, didn't breathe, as far as he could tell. And in those 3 seconds, he watched her face do something extraordinary. He watched it move through the complete spectrum of human emotion: shock, disbelief, anger, grief, hope, and then something he had no name for, something that lived on the far side of all of those things. She said one word, his name, his real name, the one from before, and in that single syllable, every wall the program had built inside him, every carefully engineered barrier, every calibrated containment, gave way.
The truth came out. As it always does, eventually, as it must, if the people carrying it have any intention of surviving it. He told her everything, not in one sitting, not in one night. It took weeks, weeks of conversation and silence, and the kind of anger that burns so cleanly it is almost like love. Weeks of her telling him what those years had been, and him listening with the full, undivided attention of a man who understands that listening is the only honest thing he can offer. She did not forgive him immediately. She was not that kind of woman, and he was not looking for that kind of forgiveness, the quick, easy kind that costs nothing and means less. What she gave him was something harder and more valuable. She gave him access to the truth of what had happened. She confirmed things his fragments had only suggested. She filled in the gaps, and she let him meet his daughter. Her name was Mara. She had her mother's eyes, as the photograph had suggested, and his jaw, and a laugh that was entirely her own, a great, uncalculated, world-filling laugh that seemed to belong to someone with no memory of loss and no knowledge of shadows. Because she didn't. Because Elena had given her that, a childhood without shadows. He sat across from her at a kitchen table, and she looked at him with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to protect herself from strangers, and she asked him if he knew any magic tricks. He had been trained in sleight of hand for operational purposes. It had been on page 47 of a training manual that had nothing to do with kitchen tables or laughing children. He did a card trick. She was delighted, and something in him that had been held at such extreme tension for so long, something he hadn't even known was clenched, finally, slowly, released. The documentation he had gathered during those 48 hours before his departure, the recordings, the files, the evidence of what had been done not just to him but to others like him, found its way to the right people.
Not through official channels. Official channels were where evidence went to disappear, but through the quiet, relentless infrastructure of people who had also been in the shadows long enough to understand where the light actually came from. There were consequences, investigations. Men who had operated for years behind layers of sanctioned authority suddenly found those layers very thin. Some of them resigned, some of them didn't get to resign. He was not there for any of it. He had removed himself from that world with the same precision he had once used to enter it, and he had no interest in watching it burn from a position of vindication. Vindication was for people who needed the world to acknowledge what had been done to them. He had something better. He had his name back. He had his daughter's laugh. He had a kitchen in a quiet street, and a woman who had survived the unsurvivable and was, against all probability, willing to try not to go back, because there was no back, there never is, but to go forward, into something that had no mission brief and no tactical parameters and no guaranteed outcome, something that was simply, terrifyingly, honestly, life. He had been brought back that final morning in the gray room for one reason, to finish what he started. He understood now that they had meant it as a threat, a leash, a way of pointing him back toward the work that had consumed him. But he understood, on the other side of everything, that they had been accidentally right. He had started something, years ago, in a city far from here, with a woman who smiled at a child in the street. He had started a family. And now, imperfectly, incompletely, with scars that would never fully close, and memories that still surfaced in the dark hours, he was finishing it. Not with a weapon, not with a mission, with a card trick at a kitchen table, with his daughter's laugh, with his own name spoken aloud in daylight. That was enough. That was everything.